I frankly see that we're in the same place right now as it relates to artificial intelligence and deepfakes. For the first time ever, back in that world of credit cards, people were wondering, Jesus, is someone out using my card and I'm going to be stuck with it?
It
Now
is.
people are wondering, are people impersonating me? Hey everyone, Pat Kinsel, founder and CEO of Proof, and I'm joined today with David Stearns, the author of Electronic Value Exchange, a fantastic book on the history of Visa and the payment networks. This is episode 4, the last episode of this series. What we're talking about are the parallels between payments and identity. And we've talked about the history of the payment industry, how hard it was back in the day to process transactions, the amount of fraud that was rife in that system, the advent of a persistent credential that people could use across a network. We talked about the policies and the framework for that network. But ultimately, one of the most important things in a payment system are the people who use it. And so today we're going to talk about consumers. And so to get us started, David, maybe I'll share a story for some of the younger folks out there, which is when I was a kid, I was very fortunate. My mother traveled with us a lot internationally. And she was a professor actually at Stanford University and had faculty housing. And we would go get to live in other people's houses around the world. And they'd come live in ours. It was a really cost-effective way to travel the world. And my mother would give me a money belt that I would hide under my shirt and tuck into my pants.
Yeah.
And let me just tell you, when you're 12 rolling around Paris, it's not the coolest look. And in that money belt, I would have traveler's checks.
Business.
And for folks who don't know what a traveler's check is, these are American Express issued traveler's checks. You would go into an American Express and you would give them either cash or an equivalent. And they would give you this thing called the traveler's check, and you get them in increments, $100, $500. And you go anywhere in the world and you give this to them and they would instantly accept it. And American Express stood behind it. It was basically a check from American Express. And I don't have to do that anymore. I travel constantly, and I just, without even telling my bank, I land in some foreign country and I buy a coffee. And so how did we get there? How are we to the point as a consumer where that's possible?
Yeah. Traveler's checks were fantastic. Visa actually also issued traveler's checks for a hot minute. But they are a thing of the past now. It seems like, you don't see them very often, certainly anymore. It's actually quite amazing, right? When you think about it. You, like you said, could go anywhere in the developed world, pop into any merchant, no matter how small, pop down the Visa card, and you and that merchant are represented by totally different banks in totally different banking systems. And often the merchant's account is denominated in a different currency than the account that your card is denominated in. But somehow it just works. Somehow the merchant goes, oh yeah, I can take that, and runs it through the machine, and within a couple of seconds at the most receives an authorization approval, which is a guarantee that that merchant will get paid. In the same way that the American Express traveler's checks was a guaranteed check. It wasn't like a personal check that you wrote, which no merchant would ever accept in a foreign country, because how would they know it would even be good? But that approval code that they get through their point of sale terminal with a card is a guarantee that they will get their funds in their local currency that night, right? That's kind of amazing. It's sort of crazy that this exists. And I think I wrote in the book or maybe it was a different paper that says it's a testament to the rate of technological change that we no longer think of this as amazing. Like, we just think of it as every day, and like, of course it works that way, right? This was a long way in coming. As I mentioned, the origins of Visa is the Bank Americard system, which starts just in California, that it expands to licensee banks. And interestingly, one of the original licensee banks for the Bank Americard was a bank in the UK. So they were actually international from a very early stage, but very limitedly, of course. But as the system grew, Visa became an independent organization from Bank of America. It was just Bank of America became just one member of that system. And that was known as Visa USA eventually when it was rebranded. But there was also similar organizations that were happening in all the other countries at the same time too. Each country was building kind of a local network of card issuing banks and doing something very similar to what was happening over here. And then eventually these networks sort of start coming together joining up together into Visa International and MasterCard in their particular open loop network as well. And these become worldwide networks that are able to facilitate authorizations 24/7, online, electronic, anywhere in the world, and also provide multi-currency settlement on a regular basis, which is no small feat. But what's fascinating about the scenario you described too, right, is that not only does the merchant, they don't know who you are. You look probably nothing like the people where you were landing. You don't even speak a common language with that merchant, but they can look at your card and go, oh, yes, I can take this. And you can look at the merchant's storefront and see the same Visa logo, right? That's on the card. The fact that that merchant has that logo, the fact that the merchant can see that logo on your card, that's what immediately lets everybody know that this is a place where this transaction can occur. Even beyond that, I also know the merchant knows that they'll get their money from the approval code. And I, as a consumer, know that I'll be protected if something goes wrong. Because I don't know, maybe that merchant is a little scammy and maybe they're just popped up that storefront and they're going to use my credential and steal it and go off and do some illegal transactions with it. What's great is I know as a consumer that I'm protected from any of those ill effects because I can dispute any transaction that I think is fraudulent. It gets taken off of my bill right away. It gets charged back to the merchant. Ultimately, someone ends up holding the liability, but it's not me if I report that transaction in time.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I think that was a brand that was hard won.
Yes, yeah.
And it's funny, as I've learned more about all of this, and I've sort of reevaluated things that I've taken for granted. When I travel, and they say to me when I'm running a card, "Do you want the supplementary insurance?" And I say no because I'm using an Amex. Right. And I've always thought, why would they do something like that? Right. And I'm sure in hindsight, it's because they wanted to really foster this brand reputation that we've got your back. Right.
Yeah.
In all of these transactions. So maybe to talk a little bit about sort of the brand war that happened. And ultimately, what did Visa do early on to win that trust in consumers' minds and how has it played out? What did your card look like back in the day versus today?
Yeah, that's an interesting dynamic. So we should also kind of set the stage as, say, we'll go back to the early 1970s when the independent organization that would get branded as Visa in 76 gets formed. They are actually the minor player in payment cards at this time. And the building up of the brand was something that came slowly, and it's not until the 80s that they started eclipsing some of the other card brands. And initially, though, that they did have one quite strong advantage going in their favor, just based on iconography. The network that would eventually become MasterCard was originally known as Interbank. Interbank was, again, one of these, cooperative organizations, multiple banks coming together. But they adopted this very, very small logo of just a little I, a lowercase I, that would go in the very edge of the car, like in the corner. It was hardly noticeable. It was usually done in black. It didn't stand out very much. The Bank of America, on the other hand, adopted a logo that took up the entire face of the card. And it was the blue, white, and gold bands, right, that you may have seen in old pictures of a Bank of America card. And it looked a little bit like a flag. When you think about it, it looks a little bit like a nation's flag. And it had a Bank of America card as like a, very large font, blue against the white background. And they used that same logo on the merchant stickers that they would put in merchant windows. So it was very, very easy for people to recognize that here was a merchant where my card was accepted, and for the merchant to see, oh, yes, this is the kind of card I can accept. The interbank system chose to highlight the issuing bank's brand a lot more, and then that little interbank logo was sort of small and in the corner. And it actually did make it a little bit harder for them to expand because people didn't recognize that, oh, I could use my card here. And for merchants to say, oh, yes, this is a kind of card I can accept, right, in the early days. You mentioned, though, about sort of how the brand then establish trust and build up this kind of like safety that consumers have come to rely on. Part of that is through advertising. So a big chunk of what Visa does, the central Visa organization, is developing the brand. Like, we've kind of hinted at this all along, but people are often sort of surprised when I say, you realize Visa doesn't actually issue cards. Visa doesn't actually extend anyone credit. Visa doesn't sign up merchants, nor does Visa maintain those merchant accounts either. That's what the issuing and acquiring banks do. They are members of Visa as an organization, but the central Visa organization is responsible for a few, very strategic things that they do. One of them is the online electronic authorization network, which we talked a lot about in the past episodes. But another key function they do is brand awareness and brand advertising. And so there's this very classic advertising slogan you probably heard in your youth about Visa: it's everywhere you want to be. And they ran a variant of this all over the world, right? And the message was very clear that you can use this card everywhere. It's not restricted to just the United States. It's not restricted to just a certain set of merchants. This thing can be used absolutely everywhere. This kind of gave consumers the understanding of just how wide of a reach this card had. In terms of safety, now this is another kind of interesting discussion, and I'll talk for a little bit, but interrupt me if you want to steer this in a different direction. We've mentioned a couple of times that when the bank issued cards first came out, there was a lot of fraud. Partly this was due to manual paper-based processing, floor limits under which no authorization even occurred, the slowness in which things were processed through the system, all that sort of thing. If there was fraud, there wasn't much that legally protected consumers in those early days from that fraud. They would call their issuing bank, say, this is not mine, but it was kind of up to the relationship between the cardholder and the issuing bank as to what occurred at that point. There wasn't really a formal process for how to handle that. Now, this fraud got to the point where it was ridiculous. And there was a Time magazine article, the cover of Time magazine was this picture of an Icarus-like character flying up towards the sun with wings that were made of credit cards. They were credit card wings, right? And the whole article was about how reckless the banks had been and how they were issuing these cards unsolicited to consumers. They would just send them to consumers without any warning that they were coming. And so they get stolen out of mailboxes and used fraudulently for a month before anyone noticed anything was happening, right? But also that consumers were getting a little fed up with the idea that they might get stuck with the bill for this fraud as it was getting worse and worse and worse. And you mentioned in a previous episode that things are getting worse around the transactions that the identity industry is trying to facilitate right now. And that was very true in the late 60s and early 70s. And so you have Congress then steps in and starts to react. They, first of all, pass laws that say, okay, you can't send out things unsolicited anymore. You have to actually make consumers ask for the card. Not a bad idea. And then eventually the Electronic Funds Transfer Act establishes that it will be law of the land that consumers are not responsible for fraud that occurs past the first $50 on their credit cards as long as they report the fraudulent transactions within a certain time range, which is very generous. And no issuing bank is ever going to lose a customer over $50. So from then on, issuing banks said, okay, yeah, absolutely, we will just facilitate this. Visa also steps in and creates a formalized process for disputes. And Visa acts effectively like an arbiter in that process between the issuing bank and the acquiring bank and the merchant, and has a very clear process for how a dispute is processed, how soon each side has to respond with evidence as to why they think that, the charge was either fraudulent or not. And if they don't come to resolution, if the two parties don't come to resolution, then Visa actually has a team of people that acts as the final arbiter and makes a decision and says, no, this is fraudulent. No, this isn't fraudulent. And then, it's just settled, right? Now, a consumer can still go to the legal courts if they feel they weren't represented well, but most of the time it works out very cleanly and very efficiently. And like we mentioned, the consumer, the cardholder, is generally protected because they are not going to be liable due to federal law for any kind of fraud that occurs on that card.
I mean, it's just another area I didn't even realize they innovated in that domain as well. So one of the things, that you talked about that I find so fascinating is international. And we all, not everyone gets to travel all the time, but we increasingly do live in a global economy. And we may be buying things from companies overseas, right? And I think, maybe to share a little bit, something I find super interesting that not a lot of people realize is that notarizations are actually governed by the Hague Convention. And that's what an apostille is, or apostille, depending on where you live in the US and what you call it. But when you want to send a document abroad, you've got to go get it authenticated. So you get this thing notarized and you take it to the state, and the state will say, yes, this notary was in good standing, and then it'll be sent overseas. And
Mm.
so there's this reciprocity regime. It's still, based in paper and notarizations. But I think a lot about, again, KYC, AML, and the policies that banks and financial institutions have to follow for knowing who their customers are. And I don't think people appreciate that today the rules are that if you're a US bank and you want a French national or an Indian national to open an account, you have to put them through a US process. And they
Mhm.
don't have a credit score and a credit history, and they can't answer identity, challenge questions. And so when I think about the future and the world that I want to live in, and when people ask me when I'm quote unquote done
Mm.
with what I'm trying to do, I think that all of these transactions that are of high value where you have to authenticate yourself globally should exist in a system like Visa, where
Mm.
there's the appropriate domestic thing that you do if you're French, if you're Indian, and that there's a system that monitors risk and trust, and it works, it works on a global scale. Um, and that, in my opinion, is transformational. And I'm curious, like, given what you think down the line, identity authorization network, but global. What do you, how do you think this is going to end?
Yeah, so this is why Visa is an open loop system. One of the benefits of Visa being an open loop system was that they were able to accommodate an international expansion quite easily because the there couldn't be just one bank that issued cards to everyone around the world, right? You would have to have some local authority that was licensed to operate in that particular geography that would be the one who issued the card, but you want that card to be usable everywhere else that Visa cards are issued and accepted, right? And so you have to have this kind of open loop system where there's a bunch of different entities cooperating to build something far bigger than they could have ever built alone. The same would be true in these kinds of identity authorization networks as well. When you talked about KYC AML, it triggered the thought of Visa also kind of exists in a multi-layered policy regime, if you want to say it. I don't know, that's not a good way to say it, but Visa International exists to unite various organizations that are in the local regions or local countries that have to follow the rules and regulations of those countries. So the banking regulations within those countries obviously apply to those banks. And the organization that they formed within the country has to submit to whatever laws exist regarding KYC, AML, et cetera, et cetera. But that, say, like the conglomeration of French banks that were the original system that kind of made card transactions work within France, still needed to cooperate with the one in Germany and the one in the United States and the one in the UK. And so something had to exist, kind of like the UN. And when I talked to people who founded Visa, they would often say, yeah, Visa's sort of like the UN of banking. They exist as a way for all of these different regional or domestic networks and their cooperative organizations to come together, have some representation, have some control over how the system, functions, the rules that get established, how it moves forward, and how it expands. And they don't always agree with each other. They often don't agree with each other, but they have a framework that they could come together and cooperate in order to have this kind of international network that we know and we love. We don't really think of it that way. We just think Visa, like it must be just some single entity, but it's actually kind of layers of entities that get together and cooperate, similar to how any policy thing happens, right?
Yeah, it's so cool. And that's what I love about the challenge. I mean, it's product, it's policy, it's politics, it's the whole
And
thing, right?
yeah.
What a fun thing to work on. And the other thing is, you mentioned earlier the period of, the journey of consumer trust in that network, right? And that there was a period of time where they didn't trust it, and they, had concerns. If someone ships some card to my house, am I going to be responsible for paying this thing and being stuck with the bill? I frankly see that we're in the same place right now as it relates to artificial intelligence and deepfakes. And for the first time ever, back in that world of credit cards, people were wondering, Jesus, is someone out using my card and I'm going to be stuck with it? And now
Yes.
people are wondering, are people impersonating me? right? And it's so trivial to be impersonated online. And this to me is a real kind of existential issue about like what it means to be a person, right? And what it means to participate in a society and to be able to say what you did and didn't do. And so I think these are really, really critical issues that people need to solve. I guess I've really enjoyed this series with you, and I've really enjoyed getting to know you, David, and I've appreciated your insights. If I had to sort of end with a call to action for everyone out there, it's that so often people want to look at things as a technology problem, right?
Mm, yeah.
A slightly better algorithm, we're going to stop this problem. And it's not. It's an organizational problem. It's a policy problem. It's a risk. It's a pricing, problem, right? And if we really want to create a world where someone can have certainty that they're not being impersonated, that they can represent what they do in society, and that we can trust who we transact with, we've got to take on some of these foundational issues. And I think that Visa is a fantastic corollary. And so, as I've done all 3 episodes, I'll give you the last word, David, but I just want to say thank you, and I hope people have enjoyed this.
Well, and thanks for having me to come. I've learned a lot about the identity industry by talking with you guys, and I do see a lot of really interesting parallels between what has happened in the history of payments and kind of, I guess, the current state and where I see the need going in the future. As you guys talked about what your plans are and what you're trying to do, I think as well, it sounds an awful lot about, very reminiscent of what has happened in the history of payments. Obviously, the industries aren't exactly the same. Like, and one thing I would want people reading the article series to keep in mind is, we're definitely not saying that they're identical and the same history will play out. But there are a lot of resonances. And because I think you like what you said, they're trying to solve similar types of problems. And the solution space is multimodal, right? It has to involve not just the technologies, but also the organizational dynamics and the cooperation and the policies and bringing all these things together at the same time. It's true that technologies are necessary, but they're rarely sufficient. There's a whole nother layer of thing that has to get solved, a whole nother layer of problems have to get solved that have to do with building a structure in which multiple, often competitors, can come together, cooperate in such a way that they can build this much bigger network that benefits, is much bigger than anyone could have built alone. It benefits everybody, with much bigger network effects than if they had just tried to kind of create their own siloed solution and then just keep trying to expand it a little bit. But there's always going to be a border where they can't expand past it because they're just a single entity operating within a single region or a single nation. And they won't ever be able to be licensed to do that kind of work somewhere else, or it would be very difficult to expand into other regions. But if they cooperate with local players, you could create something like the UN of identity, right? You could create a system that is far broader in its application and benefits consumers as well as merchants, as well as any relying party, in ways that go far beyond what anyone could just do on their own.
Well, we're both convinced. Hopefully we won some people over. So again, I appreciate everyone listening, and I appreciate your time, David. Hope people enjoy the article series. Share it with your friends. If you've got your own take on some of these problems, we would certainly love to hear from you. And this is just the beginning of the conversation. I'm sure we'll be back with more to discuss. And so thank you again, David, and thank you to everyone out there.
Thanks for having me, Pat.